don't you fucking work? I try everything. You don't work, you piece of shit. You're getting on my fucking nerves. I want to get my map done. Ugh. How's it going, guys? I hope you enjoyed that intro. At first, I thought it was going to be somewhat funny, but now I just find it cringy. It is what it is. Today, we're going to talk about the Far Cry 5 map editor dynamic zombie, or the dynamic spawner. It doesn't have the B for zombies, but the dynamic spawner, which is this big awesome machine that you can find in the AI menu. It's this bad boy right here. So we're essentially going to talk about how this thing works, how you can use it for your maps, but most importantly, we're going to talk about the settings. So a lot of users, including myself, when I first stumbled upon this thing, I'm like, okay, you can mess with it, but I don't know what any of these settings mean. And unfortunately, the Far Cry 5 editor doesn't give you any context into how to use this thing. We're going to talk about the settings and how to make this thing work to your favor and do the things that you want it to do. Man, I got bit by a freaking mosquito right here in my forehead. Look at that. It looks crazy. Anyways, I know it's going to be distracting because it's distracting for me. So the first thing we got to talk about when we think of this spawner and we consider the way it behaves is this spawner behaves as waves, but the waves are like repeatable, so they'll spawn the same amount of zombies at the exact same rate each time, regardless of what the player does. Of course, there's a cooldown timer. There's all these settings that we can mess with, but essentially, let's just go over the settings one by one. The first one is going to be shape, and we can talk about the shape of the spawner. And essentially, what that does is, if you look at my screen right now, I have a spawner on the map, and right now the shape around it is like a box. This shape behaves like a trigger. It behaves as a zone trigger. So whenever a player steps into this zone, then the trigger will activate the zombies or the AI to spawn in. If we do a cylinder, then it's a cylinder. So then you have a cylinder shaped trigger. That's all it does. This is what triggers the AI to spawn in, and they typically spawn in wherever you place them, as long as they're linked to that spawner. So for an example, if I grab an AI from the AI management menu, let's do follower wave 2. You can do wave 2, 3, 4, or 5. Wave 1 will not work. And from my testing, anything that affects wave 1 zombies, or so I keep saying zombies, I always correlate these to zombies. Anything that affects wave 1 NPCs will not affect wave 2, 3, 4, or 5 NPCs when in relation to the spawner. So no matter what you do to wave 1, it won't affect the other 5 waves when it relates to the spawner itself. So let's do wave 2. I'm gonna choose, let's see, all dead, one dead. I'm gonna do all dead just in case that does do anything. I'm gonna grab this badass follower and I'm gonna go ahead and place her right here. Gonna select her and then go to her spawning preferences, and I'm gonna do DLC dynamic spawner capsule, and then that way we are able to link her to the spawner. So she's always gonna spawn based on what the spawner tells her to do. Another thing that I noticed is that it doesn't matter how many NPCs you have linked to the spawner, the amount of NPCs per wave you're gonna get is gonna be the same. So you can just do one NPC, and if they spawn away from sight, the player won't ever see them like spawn over each other. If you have the spawner in the player's line of sight, then you want to have the spawner, you want to have multiple NPCs around it, so when they all spawn in, they don't spawn in on top of each other, if that makes any sense. All right, so I have her linked to it. Let's go back to the spawner. All right, so the cooldown is the amount of time it takes for the NPCs to spawn in on top of each other. So if you do just one NPC, for example, and then you link them to the spawner, and your cooldown time is 5 seconds, I believe these are in seconds, and that means that you're gonna have one of them spawn in, 5 seconds will pass, and then another one will spawn in. I'm going to roughly count these. So When they get in the zone, the first one spawns in, kill her, and then the other one should spawn in about 5 seconds. Oh, I gotta be in the zone. If you're not in the zone, then the spawner does not do anything, to my knowledge. I know I said 5 seconds, but it seems like it takes a little bit shorter than that. I think it's between each spawn, so it doesn't matter if I kill her or not. I could just sit right here and I think more will spawn in. There you go, see? So it's 5 seconds in between spawn. So whether they live or die, every 5 seconds, another one will spawn in. Okay? So that's out of the way. Now we understand how the cooldown setting works. Now the wave 1 setting is actually interesting. I've messed around with this, and this is the only setting that I don't have 100% like 100% understanding of how it works, because I've set values to different settings, and sometimes they do change the way it works, but sometimes it works exactly the same. So what I think this means is the first wave that spawns in will have the number that you set here between I want to say 1 and 20. So when you first activate the spawner, the first wave should be up to 20 or maybe just 1. But there's been times where it works, other times where it goes over by 1, and then other times where it just spawns in a bunch of them, like it almost disregards the wave 1 setting. If you set this to 0, then no AI spawns. I've tried doing different tricks, and no matter what I've done, they do not spawn. Of course, this might be different on your console. This might be different if you're not using the mod that I'm using, which is Steve 64 Beats mod. But to my understanding, if you set this to 0, they're not going to spawn in because the wave 1 will never be initiated. So if wave 1 is never initiated, the following waves won't trigger. But if you set this to 8, theoretically, 8 zombies should spawn in at once, and then the rest will spawn in based on that cooldown. So let's see. Let's set this kills to 50 just for now, and then let's do wave 1 to 8, and I'm gonna bring this cooldown to 0.1 of a second, and let's see if this thing works. There you go. It did whatever it wanted. So even though I set it to 8, it spawned in the maximum amount of NPCs that it can spawn in, which I think is about 15 to 16, depending on the platform. I've heard on consoles only 12 NPCs, but on PC it's about 15. Sometimes it'll do 16s randomly. But see, that wave 1 setting didn't do anything. So if I go back to it and I set this to let's do 3. So wave 1, I would just leave that at 20 and honestly forget about it. Kills is the amount of time, the amount of enemies that will spawn in before the next wave activates. So now that I have that out at 50, that means that you're gonna have 50 NPCs spawn in from the spawner before it needs to shut down and reinitiate. So let's show you this happening, let's say in real time. I'm gonna change my class to have a light machine gun. Let's do the M60. Attachments. Let's do no silencer, extended magazine, ammunition, LMG ammo, all the way up. Okay, so I have this. I have the kills set to 50, so I'm not gonna count them, but on average, you're gonna get about 15 NPCs at once. And let's take this. Let's take them down and let's see what happens. Come on. So I would say that was probably about 50 NPCs. So now this bad boy's gonna rearm. Once it's done beeping, then the next wave will start. So that's how I said, you know, hey, waves, that's pretty much how it works. See, the next wave of 50 started. You only get so many at one given time, so you got to keep killing them for the rest to spawn in. There we go. Once they're all dead, the rest tend to spawn in. See, so this thing is not rearming itself yet because there's still, what, half of the wave are left. So the wave goes up to 50 AI, 50 NPCs. Okay, now it's doing this thing, and it's gonna reactivate, and you're gonna get more AI. So like I said, the kills just means how many kills per wave total. So it's different from cooldown. Cooldown is how long it takes for each NPC to spawn after the other. Wave 1 is how many spawn in the initial wave, which doesn't work every time. And then kills will be the amount of NPC that spawn in between each wave total. So this thing will activate, 50 will spawn in. Obviously you get 15 of those at each interval, so you get 15, 15, and then you get 15 and then in 5. Obviously if your cooldown is really low, they all just keep coming in one after the other. After you get all 50 of them killed, then this thing will start going off and it'll activate the next wave of 50. Now, rearm time is how long it takes for the spawner to actually do its blinking thing that it does after you clear that wave. So let's go ahead and bring this wave count down to 3. Let's see. I'm gonna set the wave down to 3. Cooldown. I'm gonna leave it like that. And then the rearm time, I'm gonna bring this down to. Let's see if I can get a smaller digit on here. Let's do 5 seconds. Just to play it safe, I'm gonna set the wave 1 to 3. Only reason being is I know the wave, it kind of messes with it, and I couldn't really like nail it down to one specific behavior. But I think that it's safe to, if you're gonna go under 20 for your kills, to kind of match the wave to that. That has given me the most consistent behavior. And I get a bunch. Okay. Took them down. This thing is gonna rearm really quickly. There you go. Now it's rearmed. Take the rest down. This thing is going to rearm really quickly. So compared to before, where it was taking a while to rearm, this time it's rearming really fast. So as you can see, the rearm setting just changes the how long it takes for each wave to activate. As you can see there, the kills being low didn't do much. So it did change the wave from 50 to something lower, but it's still a really high count. It's not 3. So again, some of these settings, I don't know if it's the editor, I don't know if it's only when you're doing the testing in the editor, I don't know if it's the game itself, but I know that when you get over a certain range, it does affect the dynamic spawner. But when you go really low, it doesn't really care what you put on here. But you know, if I do 20, test this thing out, and I've been messing with it for days, and it's like every time I try to nail it down, it doesn't do. See, it only spawned 2 this time. It doesn't do what you would think it would do. So I'll take them down. I think it's about 20 total, and then it starts to do the reactivation. So it's kind of, you know, it goes up and down in what it really wants to do, but it does take your settings into some consideration before it starts spawning them in and whatnot. There you go, it's gonna rearm again. So the rearm time is how long it takes between each wave to activate and start spawning in again. That's that for that setting. Offset, it's gonna be the offset for the trigger box. So if you do offset X, let me back up. It's gonna move the box in the x-axis. If you do offset y, it's gonna change the box location on the y-axis. And then if you do offset z, it's gonna go obviously up and down. And again, this thing won't work if you're not in the trigger. So if the player wanders off to a different location, that spawner is not gonna activate whatsoever. It's gonna stop. I might have wandered off of it a few times. Then just for the sake of it, let's do the size. Same thing. You got the x-axis, you got the y-axis, and then you have the z, which is, you know, how tall it will be. And then the last setting that we have is the downtime minimum alive. So that might have been why some of the things weren't working properly for me. So the way this will work is before the spawner rearms, there needs to be a minimum amount of AI left. So one thing that I won't do is I won't set the downtime minimum alive to 0, because if you do that, then they would stop, the waves will stop. So you only get one wave and that's it. If you set it to 1, then whenever there's one NPC left from that wave, the next wave will start to trigger, and that's when you get the spawner beeping to do its thing. There you go. There is a delay on this thing, so sometimes it takes a little bit longer for it to realize that there's nobody left, and then it will do its thing, activate, and spawn in the next wave. If you set it to a higher number, one way to get this thing to always work is to do 20. If you want it to always be going off constantly, you set it to 20, you'll never have 20 NPCs left, except for each wave. So boom, 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 boom. So there you go. If you put this thing to 20, it will be the fastest way of getting it to spawn in really fast. So that's gonna be pretty much it for the settings. Downtime minimum alive is how many NPCs are left before it starts to activate again, and then trigger the rearm time, which would then trigger the next wave, which will have the amount of AIs you place on, or the number of AIs that you have on the kill option. So this thing is it's not too complex, but it's not consistent. That's all on Ubisoft, whatever they're doing on the back end. Maybe it's on us, we don't really understand it. Again, there's no proper documentation, so this is the unofficial guide on how to use the dynamic spawner. Of course, I've seen it to where sometimes one setting will do one thing consistently 3 times, 4 times, 6, 7 times in a row. Then the 9th time, it will just do something a little bit random. It's almost like the settings are a recommendation for the spawner in some of the settings, because they don't always do what you think they would, even if you think you have an understanding of them. Of course, do keep in mind that some of these settings affect the other settings. So for example, kills is going to affect your downtime minimum alive, your cooldown will affect the rearm time. So all these things do affect each other just in certain ways. However, I think this is probably the best understanding that you're going to get from this spawner, unless we get official documentation from Ubisoft, or maybe a description below each of the setting on an update or something, which I don't know. I don't think we're gonna get any updates for this thing. But yeah, it's not too complicated. Now, if you're gonna use a dynamic spawner and you ask me, hey, Fallen Ninja, how should I use this spawner? How should I put this on my map? They work best on zombie maps because they have the zombie aesthetic, especially with all that fog everywhere. If you're gonna use them for regular NPCs, I would recommend you hide them. The way you would hide them is to rotate them, put them on the ground, and you're still gonna get that fog. However, you won't have the spawner. And if you do hide them, then the players can't destroy them, so they're always gonna have AI coming at them as long as they're inside of this box right here, inside of this spawner box. Remember that the player needs to be within this trigger point, in order for the spawner to work. Otherwise, nothing's gonna happen. From my testing, the NPCs will constantly spawn in non-stop until this thing gets destroyed. I've heard that they stop working after a certain number of enemies. Maybe that's a console thing, but on PC, from my testing, again, this is all my testing at with the recent build of the game, the spawner just keeps on spawning and spawning and spawning and spawning until the player destroys it, which is by blowing up those those glass cylinders in there to let all that juice out. This spawner is excellent for zombie maps, or if you make an area where your character spawn in like in a hidden room or somewhere out of sight, and they make their way into the playable area, some place where the players can't get to but they can come out of. That way you can get that wave effect where the NPC just keep coming and you can't seem to get them to stop showing up to kill you. Alright, once again, let's go through the settings just really quickly. Cooldown affects how often the NPC spawns in after the other. So if you set this cooldown to, God bless, 3600 seconds, that means it's going to take a few minutes, maybe an hour, for the next one to spawn in after that one spawns in. Wave 1 typically sets the number of wave on the initial trigger of that spawner. So the minute the player walks into that trigger point, then you should get on wave 1 only anywhere between 1 and 20 zombies. Obviously the limit is 15, but whatever, at once before the total count start to go up again. Again, this thing varies. To my experience, it works sometimes. Most of the times it just ignores it and it goes straight to the regular wave. Kills is the number of kills that you can get per wave. So the player, if he set this to 50, that means that each wave is going to be 50 enemies coming all at once before the capsule rearms. Again, once the capsule rearm, the time that you set on the rearm time setting will be how long it takes for that beeping sequence to go through. Once that beeping sequence is done, then you're gonna get the zombies or the next wave to spawn in. Excuse me again, I'm saying zombies because I always correlate this thing to the zombies because that's where it came from. So if you set this bad boy to 60 seconds, it's gonna take a whole minute before the spawner rearms completely and you get the next 50 or whatever kill settings you have wave to come through. The offset handles the location of the spawner trigger box where it'll activate, so you can actually place this thing like all the way over there, the trigger box, and place the AI all the way over there. And again, as soon as you walk in that box and the AI that's placed over there, they will spawn over there. They don't spawn where the capsule's at. They spawn in wherever you place them because they're again linked to the spawning preference to that capsule. So you can actually have this off map if you want and still have that same feature. I don't know why they didn't make one that was like invisible or one that was easier to kind of mess around with for other types of maps that's not zombie related. Again, it's one of those small things. Downtime minimum alive. Again, this thing is kind of buggy. If you set it to 0, to my experience, it won't rearm the spawner box. But this handles how many AIs are left before the next rearm time triggers or activates. So if you set this to a low number, typically when there's that many, let's say you put it to 3, and when there's 3 AIs left out of that wave, the next one will trigger. You set to 20, then whenever there's 20 AIs left on that next wave, that's how long it would take for the rearm to trigger. It's kind of complicated if you talk about it too much, but it's not too difficult. Again, a lot of these settings, they do what they intend to do. However, in my experience, I've had it a few times where it's like, hey, you're not doing what you said you're gonna do, or you're like, I thought I set it to this, nothing is happening. The best thing that I can recommend you do is you mess with it and try it out. And it took me about 3 hours to kind of get all the settings down almost to a science. Again, that wave 1 kind of gets me, and sometimes when you think something's gonna work it doesn't really work the way you thought it would. But that's gonna be it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, comment below with more suggestions, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.